I remember, as if it were yesterday, though it was 1983, standing as a boy of 7 on our front lawn and feeling a sense of place and belonging. I can still name virtually every family in the street. Immediately to my left were the Petersons, the boys Ian and Lars, Danish ancestry on their paternal side, Scottish on their mothers. 2 doors down, Mrs. Warnock, then the Dates and the Basmans. Across the road, the twins, Selma and Merv, who claimed their address was 1 Brighton Street because it was the first house on the street to be built, though the council insisted on the number 13. And why not? Bad luck had followed them. Merv had marched across the dust of the Middle East and through the mud of New Guinea, only to lose both his legs, not to enemy shell, but to a flour mill in peacetime. Selma bore the alpine air of Switzerland, captured in a collection of cowbells that she had brought with her, and a Calvinist faith as unyielding as the Alps. Her charity was boundless. And so it went. The Herberts, the Yateses, the Marxes, the Davises, and the Harolds, an English family, the Robertses, the O'Shanasseys, and the Corteses, the Italian family who ran a pizzeria by the beach. On the other side, the Goffs, the Corks, the Fultons, the Moores, and the Pigots. And below us, the Douglases, the Havenhands, and the Merrileys. On Bong Bong Street, the Frasers, the Clarks, the Phippses, and the McCaffertys, a Scottish family, though their Australians had the sandy-haired beach look of the second generation. We were not merely neighbours. We were a small republic of trust. We roamed the town in cheerful disorder, leaving our bikes scattered on lawns, and played cricket in the streets. We lit bonfires on vacant blocks for the Queen's birthday and slept those nights under the stars around the shrinking flames. The men belonged to Apex and Rotary and Lions. The churches, Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist and Catholic, stood as markers of faith and continuity. My own home was Catholic. Selma, Nana, as we called her, came to my confirmation on the condition, she said to my mother, that she could explain why statues were unbiblical folly. Merv, a lapsed Catholic, came on the condition that he could bring a 6-pack. There was something deeper than politics or denomination at work, something even more ancient, what Henry Parkes called a crimson thread. We were a people. We are a people. Kiama in those days was yet to be filled in. Blackberries grew in the summer behind our house. At night you could hear 2 eternities conversing, the cattle lowing from unseen paddocks and the sea breathing in and out as it turned in its bed. Some vacant lots in the distance held horses. Others, closer to us, held snakes. Before the Petersons built next door to us, their block was a jungle of grass until Merv, Pop, balanced on his stumps with a garden hose, set it alight to drive out the red-bellied black snakes. The fire brigade arrived. Merv was rebuked, but the street cheered. 1983 was the year we won the America's Cup, the year that Down Under felt like the national anthem. In the following years at school, I learnt about Cook and Tasman and Hartog and Van Diemen and Dampier, great European explorers. We were the descendants of the English, the Scottish, the Welsh and the Irish for the most part, Anglo-Celtic, yes, but part of something larger, the long story of Europe. we looked like the Americans whom we sailed against in the America's Cup, and like the English we saw on the television in the goodies, Doctor Who, in Minder, and Rumpole, Fawlty Towers, and All Creatures Great and Small. And yet we were distinct, proud in our difference, secure in our inheritance. In the 1980s, a class excursion to old Sydney town was a rite of passage. We wandered among the recreated colonial streets, watched convicts in leg irons breaking rocks, saw soldiers in red coats drilling under the hot sun, and watched on as a man was lashed. We laughed at the theatricality, but somewhere in it lodged a sense that our world had grown out of that one, that the ordered streets and heritage buildings we knew in Kiama had their forebears in those rough beginnings. As Mary Gilmore, the Australian nativist, defender of white Australia and fixture on our $10 note, said, in the voice of a settler, "I broke the rocks, I felled the trees. This country is because of me." At school, we also learned of the gold rush and the Eureka Stockade, the flag with the white cross on blue and the miners who swore an oath beneath it. We were taught to see it as a moment of Australian spirit, a fight for fair treatment. It was pretty clear to us that we were not Chinese, but the Eureka Stockade dispelled any doubt. When, in Les Murray's words, our Mandarins now, in one more evasion of love and themselves, declare us Asian, I am reminded of what I learnt about our people back then. These stories were folded into our sense of ourselves, giving us not just local pride, but a place in a wider national drama, the struggle for our people, for Anglo-Celtic Australia. In 1988, when I was 12, the year of the bicentennial celebrations, that sense of belonging seemed to reach a peak. Across the country there were parades, tall ships in Sydney Harbour, reenactments, concerts and fireworks, an unabashed display of pride in 2 centuries of European settlement. The mood was confident, even exuberant. We saw ourselves as a young nation, vigorous and successful, with a shared story and a bright future. There was no embarrassment then in celebrating our British heritage, our democratic institutions, or the civilization we had inherited and made our own. We did not hate Aboriginal Australians. We knew many of them did it tough and had done it tough long before Europeans arrived. And we were glad to see them benefit from the civilization that our ancestors brought them. We were moved by accounts of great men like David Uniapon, whose image adorns the $50 note, who declared that the coming of our people to this continent was the best thing that ever happened to his people. In 1989, Alan Border's team regained the Ashes in England and upon returning received a ticker tape parade. Look at the names of that touring party: Border, Jones, War, Alderman, Healy, Marsh, Boone, Lawson, Hughes, Campbell, Rackerman, Zura, Hones, Taylor, May, Moody, Valletta. One Northern Italian name, one Austrian name, one Dutch, one Germanic, and the rest English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. My own lineage is similarly quilted, Irish in name, but with Dutch, English threads descending on my paternal line from Anne Davis, convicted in Gloucestershire in 1789 and transported on the Lady Juliana in 1790. Across generations, my forebears crossed between Anglican, Protestant and Catholic shores. In miniature, this is Australia's story, a people formed from scattered pieces of Britain into something new. We are comprised, as one 19th century commentator observed, of the strength of the English, the merriment of the Irish, and the keenness of mind of the Scots, drawn from the British Isles and blended on new soil into something distinctive. The distinctiveness had been noted as early as 1827, when P. Cunningham observed of the children of convicts and settlers, "They are easily distinguishable from those born in England. They grow up tall and slender, and are generally remarkable for that Gothic peculiarity of fair hair and blue eyes, which has been noticed by others." Such observations remind us that both in appearance and temperament, the Australian ethnicity was taking shape within half a century of settlement. As a child, I never questioned it. I was Australian. We were Australians, as natural as gum trees or sandy feet. And it was not simply a civic identity, it was an ethnic identity. Yet the comfort and the security that we enjoyed were not accidents. They were built patiently, deliberately, painstakingly by British law, custom, traditions, some Irish rebelliousness, and Christian faith in its Anglican, Protestant, and Catholic iterations. They were guarded by the White Australia policy, which sought not merely to exclude, but to preserve and protect a people and a way of life. Long before, or in the lead up to Federation, Henry Parkes understood this. He envisaged an Australia drawn together under one flag, one destiny, and one people, united not only in political purpose, but in racial kinship. For Parkes, one people meant predominantly those of British stock and other Europeans who assimilated into our number, whose shared ancestry, language, and institutions would form the bedrock of the new nation. This was more or less taken for granted. His was a vision of unity grounded in continuity with the civilization from which we sprang. One need not believe in notions of racial purity or racial superiority to acknowledge the reality of race, or that racial differences at scale matter in certain and often important respects. Nor does recognising such differences mean hating other people or other races. Indeed, a healthy respect for these differences can help one to appreciate the unique gifts and contributions that different racial and ethnic groups make to the world when given time and space and opportunity to pursue their unique destinies and their particular cultures. Henry Parkes was clear on this. His objection to Chinese immigration did not come from contempt for the Chinese, but for a sense of protection of his own people. He feared that the Chinese would outcompete his own people, our people, displacing white Australians from jobs and, in time, from our way of life. We see the echo of this today. Selective high schools, once the pride of Anglo-Celtic communities and sustained by our traditions of sport as much as study, of the idea of the all-rounder, have become dominated around our major capitals by migrant groups who value different pursuits. Rugby, for example, at Sydney Boys High, has withered. Old boys feel alienated, and a living tradition has been broken. Australian swimming suffers now because groups now ascendant in our cities are not drawn to it. These are not small matters. They show how culture is eroded bit by bit when the people who built it lose their central place. It is in such ways, streets renamed, statues removed, traditions displaced, that we find ourselves being replaced. And here lies the great double standard. every other group in Australia is encouraged, even funded, to preserve its culture and to act in solidarity. When we do the same, it is branded as racism. Unless we break through this hypocrisy and become indifferent to such accusations and scornful of such accusations, our inheritance will not survive. At Federation in 1901, white Australia was not a peripheral idea, but the central unifying cause across political parties and colonies. The delegates to the constitutional conventions saw the continent's future as resting on the preservation of the British-derived population and culture, and one of the very first acts of the new Commonwealth Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act, the legislative embodiment of white Australia, which all sides hailed as essential to nationhood, to our preservation as a people. Edmund Barton, Australia's first Prime Minister, made the White Australia policy a foundation stone of the new Commonwealth, and his successor, Alfred Deakin, would declare, "A white Australia does not by any means just mean the preservation of the complexion of the people of this country. It means the multiplying of homes so that we may be able to defend every part of our continent. It means the maintenance of conditions of life fit for white men and women. It means equal laws and opportunities. It means protecting against underpaid labour of other lands. It means the payment of fair wages. A white Australia means a civilisation whose foundations are built on healthy lives, lived in honest toil, under circumstances which imply no degradation. A white Australia means protection." Jack Lang, the great Labor Premier of New South Wales, a champion of working people, shared this conviction. For Lang, white Australia was not a Tory slogan, but the guarantee of fair wages and living standards for his people, for our people. He argued that without it, the gains of Australian labour, its conditions, wages, dignity, home ownership, would be undercut by imported, sweated labour. Lang's White Australia was a shield for the worker as much as for the nation. This understanding also shaped the way Australia saw its role in the world. Billy Hughes in the First World War and John Curtin in the Second both conceived their nation's participation as nothing less than the defence of white Australia. Hughes, fearing the defeat of Britain would expose Australia to mass non-European immigration, spoke bluntly of the need to secure the continent from the encroachments of Asia. And Curtin, invoking the standard of white Australia, facing the Japanese advance, declared that the war was for the preservation of the Australian people and the kind of civilisation we represent. For them, the sacrifices our men made at Gallipoli, in France, in the Coral Sea, in New Guinea, were the ultimate proof of the will to defend Australia for our people. In Merv, Pop Twin, our neighbour and my surrogate grandfather, I beheld the living embodiment of that spirit. When he told me how he had watched men die, I felt their blood pouring out for me, for us. As I listened to him, I visualised him and his mates walking through the sandy deserts of the Middle East and trudging through the mud of the New Guinea jungle for me, for us. Anzac Day was a joyous and a sombre day. The memorial arch in town, in all towns, but in Kiama, was a mystical gateway through which we had travelled to the Australian dream. One can pass through it to this day into Hindmarsh Park and see the children frolicking in the freedom won for our people by men like Merv. Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, and Arthur Calwell, the first Minister for Immigration and later Labor leader, both saw the White Australia policy as essential to national unity, social harmony, and cultural cohesion. Menzies called it the right policy for Australia, a prudent safeguard for the nation's character, compatible with generosity to assimilable immigrants. Calwell, a Catholic, described it as the most important aspect of the nation's immigration program, rooted not in racial hatred, but in the conviction that Australia's social standards, wages, and democratic institutions depended on a culturally cohesive population, a national trust to be preserved for future generations. These men all understood a nation to be what the Australian Concise Oxford Dictionary defines a nation as being: a community of people of mainly common descent, history, and language, who form a sovereign state or inhabit a territory. This is not a multicultural proposition nation. It is not a community of immigrants from all parts of the world, though it may assimilate some and harbour some ethnic minorities who enjoy the full rights of citizenship. It is, like all nations, built on shared ancestry and history. White Australia once denoted the state-forming people of this land, an ethnically distinct group from Aboriginal Australians and from the Chinese and other Asians who had arrived in the gold rush, and the Kanakas who provided cheap labour in the north. That individuals from time to time marry across these groups and others in no way obliterates the distinctiveness of the groups themselves or their unique identities or sense of ethnic kinship. The term white is, in rhetorical terms or poetic terms, a metonym, as black is for Aboriginal Australians, as it was for Nicky Winmar when he said he was black and proud. It is a racial marker of a people, one that stands for the whole, but does not exhaust the significance of our difference from others. Anglo-Celtic Australian sounds more precise, true, yet our forefathers preferred the term White Australia because it acknowledged the British core while recognising that the ethnicity could, in small measure, absorb other Europeans without losing its essential character. Percy Stevenson, who had no British ancestry, had no hesitation in declaring in 1936, "We are, in extraction, solidly and stolidly pure British of the 19th century, homogeneously British, 90% British. The 10% comprises Germans and Danes who become assimilated immediately, with a sprinkling of Latins and sundries who become assimilated within a generation. The only big minority in the 90%, he said, is the 25% Irish, who, whether they admit it or not, come from one of the two major British islands." His point about the Irish is that whether they were politically British, they hailed from the British Isles. As Neville Meaney has shown, Irish Catholics had a complicated but ultimately loyal place within British Australia. He notes that Irish Catholics represented about a quarter of the population but did not live in ghettos, and this helped to foster trust and a common civic feeling. Before the 1970s, the ethnic majority in this country was simply called Australians. This was not, however, a civic label alone, but an ethnic group, a people named for the continent that our British ancestors had claimed and settled and built a nation upon and federated. Today, however, we live under a double standard. Aboriginal Australians are encouraged to identify proudly as a people or group of peoples with distinct ancestry, culture and history. Migrant communities are praised for maintaining their ethnic traditions and bonds. Even political and funding structures are built with our money to support their cohesion. And it is now self-evident that there are hugely influential migrant voting blocs, particularly among the Chinese and Indian communities in this country. When Anglo-Celtic Australians seek to gather together as an ethnic group, however, affirming the same principles of heritage, kinship, and solidarity, we are told it is exclusionary, divisive, even illegitimate. Some even dare to suggest, as Les Murray once observed, that our unique identity, our culture, and our loves, unlike theirs, are fictive ideological constructions. What was once considered the natural expression of a people's right to exist has been recast for us alone as a moral failing. We must assert not only that it is not a moral failing, but that it is the only moral position any self-respecting people can take. The street of my childhood was a living example of Australia, of the Australian people. For the most part, heirs of the Irish, the Scottish, the English, and the Welsh, with some Northern Europeans and one or two sundries in Percy Stevenson's phrase, woven into something new, yet recognisably of the same cloth. We could roam the night without fear, play in each other's homes, and leave the house at sunrise in summer to wander the beaches and fields until dinner time, because a civilization had been patiently constructed for us, high trust, culturally cohesive, bound by shared ancestry, history, and faith. And this continent and the nation that our ancestors built, its schools, its hospitals, its churches, all of its infrastructure of our towns and our cities was our inheritance. And like all inheritances, it can be squandered, and much of it has been. But if it was built once, it can be built again, provided we remember not only who we are, but how we came to be. Preserving this inheritance means speaking plainly about immigration. A nation cannot remain cohesive if its historic majority is steadily diminished by mass immigration on a scale that prevents assimilation. Mass immigration must not only be stopped, it must be reversed. This is not a call for isolation, but for sensible and firm reform. Policies that prioritise integration, protect wages and housing, and ensure the Anglo-Celtic Australian majority remains the cultural and demographic centre of gravity, just as Singapore actively protects its ethnic Han majority to ensure it does not fall below 70% of the overall population. Without such measures, no amount of heritage festivals or commemorations will save the character of the country that our ancestors built and they passed on to us. Remembering is not enough. In today's multicultural context, we must be willing to speak openly about our identity and our interests as a people. Every other community does so. White Australians must reclaim that same right without apology to name ourselves and to demand that our politicians name us, to tell our story, and to affirm not only that we, too, are a people with a shared ancestry, history, and culture worth preserving, but that we are the nation-forming people of this country. We are the descendants of the colonial settlers. We are not simply a random collection of immigrants. We must assert democratically and peacefully our right to our homeland. we must assert this in the same way that we acknowledge that the Jews have a right to an ethno-religious state, that the Palestinians have a right to a state, that the French, the Irish, the English, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, the Indians, and indeed all ethnic groups have the right to self-determination, sovereignty, and a unique home of their own, where they are free to pursue as a majority their ethnic and national interests. We can begin by building cultural confidence, supporting institutions, associations, and events that pass on our traditions, from Anzac Day commemorations to historical societies, heritage festivals and clubs, and calling out, as the BAC has done a terrific job at doing, attacks on our monuments, on our people, and on our history. Culture wars are real wars with real victims, and I don't want my children to be counted among those victims. We must think twice about sending children to any schools, which unfortunately is a majority of them, that actively attack our legacy, our people, and our way of life. We must enter public debates with a clear voice, insisting that national policy recognise and protect the historic majority as an integral, continuous people, not just an undefined residue in a nation of immigrants. In time, we must form political parties expressly dedicated to the interests and rights of our people. Most of all, we must live the inheritance we claim, forming strong families, participating in civic life, in our churches, and offering the high trust and loyalty that once defined our streets and our towns. If we must separate ourselves in order to preserve our way of life, as the Chinese do in Hurstville, or the Vietnamese in Cabramatta, or the Indians in Harris Park, or the Lebanese Muslims in Lakemba, we will, but only ever as a tactical retreat, for we must aim to remake our country in our own image. Only in this way will we ensure that our identity is not a relic, but a living tradition. This is how we honour what was built for us and the lives sacrificed in our defence, and how we ensure that future generations inherit not just the name Australian, but the people and civilisation it once so clearly described.